So, dear and respected friend, thank you so much for having here, and thank you so much for attending today's talk, the Chittaranjan Century Memorial Lecture. We are going to start today's session with an invocation of a song. So let me just share the screen.
जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा जय जगत पुकार जा सिर अमन पे वार जा
जय जगत पुकार जा सिर अमन पे वार जा
सबके हित के वास्ते अपन सुख बिसार जा
सबके हित के वास्ते अपन सुख बिसार जा जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा
की पुकार हो सबका सबसे प्यार हो
प्रेम की पुकार हो सबका सबसे प्यार हो
जीत हो जहान की क्यों किसी की हार हो
जीत हो जहान की क्यों किसी की हार हो जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा
न्याय का विधान हो सबका सब समान हो
न्याय का विधान हो
सबका हक समान हो सबकी अपनी हो जमीन सबका आसमान हो
सबकी अपनी हो जमीन सबका आसमान हो जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा
रंग भेद छोड़ दो जाति पाति तोड़ दो
धर्म भेद छोड़ दो जात पात तोड़ दो
मानवों की आपसी अखंड प्रीत जोड़ दो
मानवों की आपसी अखंड प्रीत जोड़ दो जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा जय जगत जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा
शांति की हवा चले जग कहे भले भले दिन उगे स्नेह का रात रंज की ढले शांति की हवा चले जग कहे भले भले दिन उगे स्नेह का रात रंज की ढले दिन उगे स्नेह का रात रंज की ढले
दिन उगे स्नेह का रात रंज की ढले जय जगत जय जगत
जय जगत पुकार जा जय जगत
जय जगत जय जगत पुकार जा
जय जगत पुकार जा सिर अमन पे वार जा
जय जगत पुकार जा सिर अमन पे वार जा
सबके हित के वास्ते अपने सुख बिस
Thank you so much for your kind attention. I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of Swadhyay Sahchakra Circle for Co-Learning and Mutual Studies, welcome you to join us in our Swadhyay Sahchakra Chittaranjan Century Memorial Lecture on the very topic, folk schools, Highlanders, and the calling of transformative and community leadership. Dear and respected friend, this lecture is being co-jointly co-nurtured by the School of Humanities and Social Science of Raffles University and Vishwanathan Center for Asian Blossoming, Puducherry and Chennai. It is a great pleasure and indeed an honor to have available to us distinguished speaker, Professor David Black-Wills of Fielding Graduate University, California, USA. I welcome you, sir. And respected friend, kindly mute yourself so that we can avoid disruptions. Yes, thank you so much. I welcome Professor Kumar Giri from Madras Institute of Development Studies, Chennai, and Honorary Executive Trustee of Vishwanathan Center for Asian Blossoming. I welcome all the respected participant, viewer, listener, both on Facebook platform and Zoom platform. Let me give a kind of brief introduction to Professor David Black-Wills. Professor David Black-Wills is a professor of anthropology and education in the School of Leadership Studies at Fielding Graduate University. Professor David is professor of anthropology. He taught and did research at University of Oxford 2006 to 2007 and has been a visiting professor at Grinnell College and the University of Washington. His interests in anthropology, sustainability, social justice, and immigration comes from 35 years living in a traditional cultural systems in Japan as well as in India. He researches his research and his writings on transformational leadership and educational human development in transnational context, comparative education, citizenship, transcultural communities, transnational diasporas, adult education, and Dalit and Gandhian liberation movement in South India is very, very remarkable. Professor David's publication include over more than 100 journals, articles, and many chapters in many books. Thank you so much, sir, for accepting our invitation. Let me give a brief introduction of Professor Chittaranjan Das. Professor Chittaranjan Das is a creative seeker and transformative thinker and activist in our times, who has written and worked on many aspects of human lives, education, philosophy, literature, and integral human development and social transformation. Professor Das was born on 3rd October 1923 in Bhagalpur in the undivided district of Cuttack in Orissa, India, and left his mortal body on January 16, 2011. Professor Das is known to many of his friends, courted travelers, and concerned publics at large in Orissa and many part of India as Chittavai. Professor Ranjan Das has initiated many creative experiments. He founded Jivana Vidyalaya, a school for life in Champapuram in 1950s. He was a pioneer in the integral education movement in Orissa and translated many works of Sri Aurobindo and Mother to Oriya. He nurtured both Agragani, Sikshanandan, and Navapallava creative efforts in education and tribal development in Orissa. He wrote and translated around 250 books, a majority of them being in Oriya and some of these in English. Today is a very special talk on a very important topic on transformative community leadership. Famous anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, I quote, "I personally measure success in terms of the contributions an individual makes to his or her fellow human being." Leadership is not positional authority, but is driven by a purpose to serve, to be able to get the best out of themselves and their teams by influencing themselves and others towards a common goal and sustainable development. Transformative leadership is taking place in diverse contexts where teaching and research is being embedded in local community objectives. That is the whole idea of think globally and act locally. With this brief introduction, now I would like to invite Professor Anant Kumar Giri sir to kindly moderate today's session.
Thank you so much, dear Randhir. And I am in a village, and I am with a very dear and respected sister and nurturer of an important school here. And connection is not the best. So with all these limitations, so it is a great joy for us to be in the enlightening presence of my dear and respected friend, Professor David Blake Willis. Professor Willis has worked with community education, the folk high school movement, Highlander, as a space of meeting together and a generative space for production of transformative leadership. Highlander provided a space where activists came together and learned together. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, they all emerged out of the roundtable conversation of Highlander. Chitabhai, when he was in Denmark, he took part in the folk high school dream. And Chitabhai also, he challenged us to understand the art of leadership. And he used to make a distinction between what he calls as kartrutva and netrutva. To provide leadership, to be a leader, is just very different from exercising authority in an authoritarian way. This cultivation leadership as a collaborative activity, mutual learning, listening to each other. At the same time, the leader taking a few steps in advance. So Professor David Willis has done very important work in the field of education and leadership. He has also studied closely the land dignity movement in South India and most recently Jai Jagat and Ekta Parishad. And so it is a joy for us to have Professor Willis present the Chitaranjan, the centenary. So I am not opening my video because the internet might have its wings. So dear David, a warm welcome.
Yes, Professor David Wills, kindly deliver your talk, sir.
Jai Jagat.
Jai Jagat.
Namaste, namaskar, salam alaikum, ohayo gozaimasu in Japanese. This is early morning here in California, USA. I am delighted to share some thoughts with you all today about leadership and transformative education. Certainly, I'm humbled by the introduction. I don't think I merit the words that Randhir and Ananta have shared here. I'm sure many of you have far more profound thoughts than I do about transformative education, folk schools, and so on. But I will share some ideas with you this morning, our time, I'm sorry, this evening, your time. I'm so sorry that we are not in India right now. We were hoping to be in India, but of course we have this shared experience of the pandemic preventing much travel now. It's really quite a serious situation now here in the United States. We're trying to be very careful. So just to give you some thoughts about that. So I will welcome comments in the chat. I'm not sure if the Facebook Live is, if it's possible for you to chat, but certainly I welcome folks' comments. My email is dwillis, DWILLIS @fielding.edu. Fielding Graduate University is where I've been teaching the last 13 years. Before that, I taught at a Buddhist university in Japan for 23 years, taught anthropology, sociology. I'm so appreciative of Randhir and Ananta for providing me this opportunity. And of course, to Chitabai for his centenary and all of the wonderful work that he did. The talk I will give you is about folk schools and folk schools in Denmark, folk schools in the United States. Also Highlander Folk School, which has a particularly important role in transformative community leadership. And I'll speak to the calling of transformative community leadership as well here. I very much appreciate Randhir's work in the recent talk with Ananta and Professor Lerba. I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, Professor. Buona serata. On creative education and cultural works for freedom, social change, and transformation of consciousness. We certainly need this, and one of the linking points between Professor Sagar Lerba's talk and mine will be around the ideas of Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire actually spent time at our university, Fielding Graduate University, in the 1990s. I knew Paulo in the 1980s and 1990s through the American Educational Research Association. I very much admire also Ananta's book, Adventures in Education, Vistas and Variations, and his earlier volume on Chitta Ranjan Das's contributions. There's a wonderful preface in one of these books by Jatindra K. Nayak of Utkal University, Bhubaneswar, Orissa. And I'll share a few thoughts from this. Randhir has already shared some thoughts about Chitabai, but I'll share a few further thoughts. Of course, he was involved in the Quit India movement, and I have been blessed to have worked with in South India people who were freedom fighters, who also were involved in the Quit India movement. And of course, some of them have passed now, but their example is still there with us. Chitabai had an experiment, as was mentioned, of running a jungle school in Champati Munda in Angul, but this didn't work out so well. So he joined a rural institute in Bichpuri, Agra, and taught there for a few years. And then he had the great good fortune to be a traveler, to be a wanderer in so many ways, like our dear Professor Ananta Giri. And his life was devoted entirely then to writing, discussion, debate, and dialogue. He spent much time, he was blessed to be able to spend time in Denmark, where he became acquainted with the ideas of the Danish Folk High School, and I'll be sharing some thoughts about that. Of course, at the center of all of this was creativity and questioning. And as a professor of PhD students, our university is only for PhD students. We have students from India, I might mention, and all over the world. Chitabai was really interested in this idea of questioning, which is at the center, of course, of graduate work. Many of you are either professors or doing graduate work. Gandhi and Tagore influenced Chitabai very much. He did spend some years at Santiniketan. and wrote a book, Window to the World, which received the Sahitya Academy Award in 1994. His emphasis on avoiding the dangers of nationalist self-assertion were very important. And we do have this problem, of course, all over the world today. The problem of a nationalist, extreme nationalism that quickly moves into this xenophobic provincialism, as Professor Nayak has said in his preface. After his return from Denmark, he started a school again in Odisha, based on the Danish folk high school movement and on Gandhi's Night Talim basic education ideas. I also note Chittaranjan Das's work with the Danish folk schools. And I've also been involved with the American folk schools through our wonderful student, Dawn Murphy, one of my mentees. Dawn is now working on her PhD dissertation, but she's also had an amazing project with American folk schools, a $250,000 grant project. She kindly made me the PI, the primary investigator on this, but really it's Dawn's work, which I will be reporting to you here, which I have been joining with her on this. There are around 100 folk schools in America, and these schools in many ways echo the Night Talim schools of India. We also have a resonance here with Chittaranjan's approach to culture and cultural creativity. He looks at culture as the eye of a society, an eye which looks at existent social reality creatively and critically. Very important to do that. And of course, he has the idea of inspiration, prirana, and contrast this with the idea of sampati, property. Very important idea. We have here, of course, in the United States, and I want to acknowledge the land that I am on, the land of the Tongva peoples of Southern California. The land acknowledgement is very important to make. The people who were originally here, we see a movement now to change the names back to the original names of different place names and names of mountains and rivers and so on. And I do want to acknowledge the Tongva peoples of this Los Angeles, Orange County area. The idea of property, of course, comes in with the Europeans coming to North America, property not as collectively shared, but as individually shared. And we all know what happened in India as well with this story. Chittaranjan, of course, considered this pathological, and he launched many attacks on people who wanted to make culture a property of the few and for the few. The folk schools are in many ways a place where these ideas of looking for inspiration, for prirana, are practiced. A recent scholar of the folk school movement, Mike Klein, wrote in a 2018 article, recent article, that this folk school tradition has promoted various conceptions of democracy and non-formal adult education. The Danish origins of this tell us about the tensions that are inherent in educating for an emergent democratic culture across differences of class, profession, and gender. I also want to mention the Social Harmony Front of our dear colleague Inamul Hassan in Puducherry. The work that they are doing is really wonderful. We've been supporting them also through the pandemic with their efforts to provide oxygen to people and so forth. The Social Harmony Front is part of Kudai Kitmagar. Kudai Kitmagar is, of course, an organization that goes back to the roots of the Frontier Gandhi. I think many of you know. And there is this work of creating a democratic culture, again, across differences of class, profession, gender, and so on. The Scandinavians are in many ways ahead of the rest of us in this kind of questioning. And then we have the later US iterations of the folk schools. Highlander Folk School is a particularly important example of this, and I'll be sharing about this. The phrase that most resonates with my colleague Don Murphy in looking at the folk school philosophy is the historic poetic method. And I so appreciate Ananta's emphasis on poetry and song. And it was wonderful to see the song earlier. I think that was Professor Vishwanathan. I hope that's who it was. And the folk school movement began with the ideas of a scholar named Grundtvig. And Grundtvig is perhaps one of the most important intellectuals in Danish history. And this idea of the historic poetic method you can find in Grundtvig's book, The School for Life. Excuse me, The School for Life. This could also be called the narrative method. Jerome Bruner, the American scholar from MIT, talks about the narrative method. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the narrative method. Grundtvig lived in the 1800s, and he was the ideological father of the folk high school. And his ideas were very important in establishing a public education in Denmark. His main emphasis was, rather than educating learned scholars, educating people to be professors, he believed that the university should educate its students for active participation in society and popular life. One of his supporters, Kirsten Kold, established the first folk high school, and I believe this is in the middle 1800s. Grundtvig's ambitions for school reform were not limited to this idea of the popular folk high school. He also talked about the folk high school as the school for life, and the university as the school for passion. Very appropriate ideas, I think, for us in an era when schooling and education has become so institutionalized. So the idea of the school for life and the school for passion, very important. Grundtvig's pedagogical efforts had a common denominator, which was the spirit of freedom, poetry, and disciplined creativity within all branches of educational life. And the values that he expounded included wisdom, compassion, identification, and equality. He opposed all compulsion, including exams, as deadening to the human soul. So you don't force people to be educated. Instead, we want to emphasize human creativity, looking at the creative order of life. And if you want to have work, only willing hands will do the work, and it will be light work if they are willing hands. So this spirit of joy in approaching education is really important to the folk school movement. This spirit of freedom, cooperation, and discovery was meant to be there as well. There are 10 lessons from the folk high school, which I'd like to mention. These are characteristics of the folk high school. And if you listen carefully, you'll get some ideas, I think, and I'll repeat this a little later in a slide I will share. You will understand how important the folk high school is in terms of storytelling. The Hawaiians speak of this as the talk story. So the talk story is very important. Of course, the media we're on today, this is all very new for human beings. But for most of our existence on this planet, storytelling has been very important for all of us. Also, communal singing. Communal singing has been important. For the folk high schools, residential schooling, the living together, eating together, working together, an emphasis on democratic education and training, of course, and enlightening the people around us. So this is very much part of the community, the idea of the folk school. So there are 10 lessons from the folk high school. Number one is become yourself. Become yourself. Number two, learn for pleasure, or I would call it joy. Learn for pleasure or joy. Number three, take responsibility. Number four, learn for life. Number five, sing together. Number 6, live together. Number 7, tell stories. Number 8, learn together. Number 9, learn through the body. And number 10, become a people. The folk schools were an inspiration for the folk school movement in the United States. And in many ways, this movement began with the Highlander Folk School. It's a very special example, Highlander Folk School. I'm going to shift now to share a meeting that we had 2 years ago actually it's 3 years ago now, in Minneapolis, USA, of folk schools. We, as part of our project of Dawn's wonderful project, we sponsored a meeting of folk schools in the upper Midwest. And I'd like to share with you some of the time with this meeting. And let's see if I can shift my screen to share my screen. I think, Randhir, I can share my screen. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes. You can share your screen.
You all can also see the sunrise is happening right now.
Yes, yes.
Here. I just have to show this to you all to share with you. The sun is literally coming up right now here in
Yes,
Southern
yes.
California. I wanted to share
Beautiful.
that with you, but I'll share my screen now.
Yes, you can see it.
And I apologize to Ananta and other people who are not able to see the screen. Perhaps you can see the recording later. So this is folk schools learning from a local transformative education. So the Chittabai talk that I'm giving with you here. Again, this was in 2018. The Folk School Alliance in North America is a network of around 100 schools. And again, I'll emphasize here, education for life. This is my student, my colleague, Don Murphy. One of the famous sayings from the folk school movement came from Ludwig Schroeder, one of the early principals of folk schools. Stick your finger down into the soil and smell where you are. This is where the needs of the people are found, which can be different in different places and times. Where this meets the abilities of the teacher, there lies the host schools, the folk schools calling. This is from the mid-1800s and has inspired many people since then. Again, from Ludwig Schroeder, 1872 is this saying. It encapsulates the role of the folk school in Danish society. Excuse me. We met at the Danish American Center in Minneapolis. And some of you may know Danish in our group today. The Danish American Center is a lovely building where people can also stay. It's actually in many ways a folk school itself. I stayed here during the meetings. This is the opening area of the Danish American Center. You can see that very much the folk school idea of expansive, open space where you can share. This is, I'm sorry, this idea of Denmark is an important one, of course, for the folk school movement, since many of these ideas came from Denmark. And this was a poster in the Danish American Center, where it came from, where we come from. Very important. The Native American folks here in North America talk about 7 generations before and 7 generations after, very similar to ideas from India and other parts of Asia. Grundtvig this is Grundtvig. His ideas were to awaken, nourish, and enlighten human life. Great inspiration for many educators. Again, here are the 10 lessons for the folk high school. I'm sorry, I went ahead there. Here are the 10 lessons from the folk high school. This is actually a book series, which is available from Denmark, looking at this different, each one is a volume in this series. And I'll linger here just a bit so you can see the these 10 lessons from the folk high school. And I would say for the American folk schools also very much follows this. We talk about the folk high school, but in many ways, it's not just the time of the secondary school. The folk high schools extend into the 20s. I even had a dear Danish friend who was still part of a folk school, folk high school, in his 30s. So this can continue. Highlander is one of the examples of these schools. No Ordinary School, as this book by John Glenn, University Press of Kentucky, mentions here. Highlander had a very important role in the American Civil Rights Movement. I'll be sharing more with you about that. Our meeting began with talk circles, learning circles, and this idea of sharing ideas together in small groups and then coming together in larger groups. Very, very important. And these are some, this again, this my student Don Murphy, and one of our graduates, Fielding Graduate University's graduates, Vicky Ivan, here in this at the meeting. And you can see they have the picture of Grundtvig next to them, inspiring them. And we're getting ready for the larger meeting, going from the small groups into the larger meeting. And very serious discussions. This was the first meeting of the leaders of folk schools. And here's Dawn opening the meeting, and again, the circle, learning circle. And we had breakout sessions, of course, around questions of courses and scheduling, fundraising, marketing of the folk schools. This is also, the folk schools have a very practical side as well. So again, very similar to Naitalim schools. Lots of talking, lots of sharing, and we all also had lots of music. We spent a good deal of time thinking about what are the issues that are important for folk schools. This was a 3-day meeting that we had. And this meeting included, this is a school this in the Minneapolis area called Danneball, bringing the ideas directly from Denmark to Minnesota, USA. Minnesota, USA, there are many Scandinavians living there. And we had small groups looking at particular problems of the folk schools. And then we would come together for a song, not only for sharing in a learning circle, but coming together for song as well. And this was a song that we all had together. I'm grateful for this lovely day, for all my work and all my play, and for the food upon my plate. That's why I sing this song of thanks. I'm grateful for a friend like you, for the gentle earth and the morning dew, and for all the things, both old and new. That's why I sing this song of thanks. So before we ate, this is, you know, asking the blessings before we would eat. So what is a folk school? It serves the local community. Learning and collaboration is very important. I think here too of the work on collaboration of the American scholar Michael Tomasello. I think it'll be good for you all to become familiar with Michael Tomasello's work on collaboration, cooperation of human beings. The folk school, you have to experience it to understand it. Reviving forgotten skills is an important part of it. Some people think these schools in North America are about learning a craft, but they are also about study circles. And people come for the craft, but they stay for the community. It was an important note we had. Less emphasis on content, more emphasis on experience, connection. It's a short-term, very intentional community. Learning to live versus living to learn. Very important distinction here. Learning to live versus living to learn. It's an education for the body, mind, and soul. And the bridging and connecting of cultures and generations. These are all important parts of the folk schools. Why a folk school? Well, to do the radical thing and stay put, stay in one place, become part of a tribe in one place. and bringing art to community. The North House School in northern Minnesota, the idea that you encourage people and yourself to be creative, use your hands. So at my university, we emphasize the scholar practitioner at Fielding Graduate University. Fielding Graduate University has been around for nearly 50 years. It was founded in Santa Barbara, California. And in many ways, the ideas of Nai Talim and the folk schools are embodied in our university as well. We talk about the scholar practitioner and honoring the work of the hands as well as the work of the mind. And of course, the work of the heart too. Emphasizing this idea that when you encounter the idea of I can't, no, you can. You just have to spend time together with people intergenerationally. And of course, for most of human history, we have lived intergenerationally. The separation of generations is something that began in the industrial era, unfortunately. So this connection to food is important, eating together, self-reliance, and direct application of the democratic process. Small practice to large results, and practicing craftspersons is very important there too. So we were, as a group, locating these ideas in our meeting, and what did we agree with, and what did we think was important for the next steps of the folk school movement. There is a YouTube channel, which I'll share with you in a moment here. You can see our meeting. People are quite serious about what we're doing, but sometimes had some good laughs too. So humor is part of all of this too. The Danes have a wry sense of humor, and that has infected the folk school movement as well. These are some pamphlets from different places, the Folklore Village, the different places in North America, and that sharing happened too. The different schools brought their literatures. North House Folk School is probably the most established folk school. It has brought millions of dollars into the local small community in northern Minnesota. The Finnish American Heritage Center, again, a kind of folk school, but emphasizing Finnish background. This Finnish American folk school is very strong, ongoing, keeping the heritages of the language and culture, Finnish language and culture. This is an advertisement for folk and Baroque music of Norway and Sweden that was sponsored by the Finnish folk school. And I'll also mention here a very interesting new experiment, the Thoreau College. Our friend Jacob Hunt has started this college, and the Thoreau College, if you look on the internet, you can find more information about it. But it's a residential program going from the folk school movement into a university setting. Again, this idea of looking for the passion. And practical side for the folk schools, looking at events, fairs, festivals, sharing with the local media what's happening, magazines, TV stations, the Chamber of Commerce and so on, and lots of ideas. There were lots of ideas about what folk schools could be doing, and having auctions, crowdfunding, class sponsor. These are popular places, the folk schools. But they're also in many ways just beginning. As I said, there are around 100 of the folk schools now, but we're seeing more. This is Jacob Hunt, I just mentioned. He founded the Thoreau College, a small, interesting experiment. I know Ananta is listening to this and thinking, I probably want to visit there. I can imagine Ananta will be there once the pandemic has calmed down. Communities and folk schools looking for aspiring artisans. So sharing that, and story circles, very packed schedules in these schools. I hope that all of you can visit the schools. This is our group. Finally, at the end of the slideshow here is our group at the end of our meeting, folk school representatives. And from there, well, we also have this idea of hygge, which is a great one. This is a great one for you all to have some sense of. And I'll open my info here. I'm not sure if you can see this, but hygge, very Danish idea. It's the idea of coziness and comfortable conviviality. And you have a feeling of contentment or well-being. And the idea of the folk school is you bring the hygge into the schools themselves. It's important to bring this into the schools themselves. Let me stop this share, and I'm sorry, I hope the sun is okay on my face here for y'all. I would like to also share with you the Folk Education Association of North America has a YouTube channel. A good part, let me share the screen about that. We have, as part of the grant that I'm the PI of, that Dawn has created, the Folk Education Association of America has created a YouTube channel with small documentaries about the folk schools. And let me open this. If you go to YouTube, Folk Education Association of America, the Folk Education Association of America. And I'd like to play for you briefly this from the Center for Belonging. This is a new folk school that has just been founded in my home state of Iowa. Iowa is in the middle of North America, a very agricultural state. Let me make this bigger so you can see. Can you hear the sound, Randhir? Could you hear the sound from the video?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
The Center for Belonging Folk School opened in May 2021. Its home hearth in a newly built gazebo in the rich woodland of the Iowa Driftless. The school emerged from old-timers and newcomers' practices of community connection and learning, and from our longing to build and strengthen bridges across divides among people and with creatures, land, and water. We were inspired by the movements of folk schools, of liberation theology, of parks and recreation programs, of community centers, summer camps, Ethiopian forest churches, and finally in 20 to 21 by the need for more outdoor gathering spaces necessitated by COVID. We shall be known by the ones who sow and reap the seeds of change, alive and deep within. When I gather with others and we are able to share our stories, that I feel enriched and connected, and new ideas form, and playing in that space grows and grows into who we become. And that brings me so much joy and so much hope. There are plenty of people to learn from. So all you have to do is ask, which we've been doing a lot of here at the Center for Belonging, learning about other folk schools. But that ultimately, it goes back to that anti-perfection. We are non-experts here. So you don't have to know where you're going. You just have to have the desire to try something new. Before books, imagine that. Before books, stories were told to weave the fabric of our lives. And we also do that by sort of, listening, the deep listening to what the greatest needs are and what people are asking for and needing, and being able to be adaptable and bring just that thing that's needed in that moment by a group of people. And we rise, humbly hearted we rise. We won't be divided, we rise. The Center for Belonging nurtures grassroots community connection in spacious time through play, art, ritual, celebration, food, and learning together in nature. We are non-experts working together to offer a humble and local response to modern times, creating enduring ways that connect us to spirit, land, and each other.
You know, our mission statement also talks about belonging within community, but also belonging to spirit and belonging to the earth. And those things are really important to me as well. And I like that the Center for Belonging specifically names those things as components that are important pieces of belonging.
It wasn't all that long ago that stories were vital, essential, important. And so this is a story I've told many times over the years. There are people here that know this story, so they get to hold their knowing and yet show up with a beginner's mind, as if experiencing the story for the first time.
Well, I really like just thinking about the word belonging. And I remember I used to think about this word belonging kind of a lot, because there were a lot of spaces that I felt I didn't. And I remember one day thinking, belonging, it's like where you long to be. It's like this, it's somewhere where you long to just be yourself. It's really exciting to think about 20 years from now, how things might be different because of what might pass through this space. Yeah.
It is time now. It is time now that we thrive. It is time we lead ourselves into the world. It is time now, and what a time to be alive. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. In this great turning we shall learn to lead in love. We shall be known by the company we keep, by the ones who circle around to tend these vows.
So this is one example of a folk school, and I think it's a fairly accurate short documentary. There are 6 or 7 other documentaries on this YouTube site. I encourage you to go there and to subscribe. If we get enough people subscribing to it, then we will have our own YouTube channel. So it's a little bit of a motive on that for me as well. I'd like to now talk just a bit about Highlander Folk School. Highlander was founded in the 1930s in Tennessee, USA, by the great American educator Myles Horton. Myles is spelled M-Y-L-E-S, Horton, H-O-R-T-O-N. Danish folk schools had inspired Myles while he was doing his graduate study. And they also echo, the Highlander echoes the earlier work of Horace Mann and Antioch College. Arthur Morgan also was an important educator at Antioch College. The idea of, again, learning while doing. I was a student of Antioch College, and Antioch has a co-op work study program. Half of your credits come from working somewhere, and half of the credits from studying. And Antioch College has been around for quite a long time. It was also the college where Martin Luther King's wife went. She was a student there. And of course, we have the influence of John Dewey and his ideas of participatory experiential education. And we can find further echoes here with my university now. Fielding Graduate University has similar roots. And of course, the Nai Talim, we were in a Nai Talim school last year in Sevagram, right next to the ashram, to Gandhiji's ashram. And I want to recognize too the powerful work of Sri T. Kannan and Srimati Nedya of Coimbatore. Their work with the roots of education appear in their daughter Mahil's songs. Mahil has songs from the Tevaram from 1,000 years ago, and I'll be happy to share those songs with you sometime. Perhaps we can have a session with Mahil. Her songs remind us that we stand on the shoulders of giants, that we have these ancestors who've been very important for us. One of Miles Horton's important influences, mentors, was Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr, a very important philosopher, educator. Miles studied at Union Seminary in New York City. And from that study, he founded the Southern Mountains School, Highlander, in Tennessee. And the goal of Highlander Folk School was to transform students and being in between. And Miles called this the equity pedagogy, the equity pedagogy. Miles later did work together with Paulo Freire. They wrote a wonderful book called We Make the Road by Walking. And I highly recommend that book to all of you. We Make the Road by Walking. This is Miles Horton and Paulo Freire talking about the purpose of education. As Miles said, if you believe that people are of worth, you can't treat anybody inhumanely. And that means you not only have to love and respect people, but you have to think in terms of building a society that people can profit most from. And that kind of society has to work on the principle of equality. Otherwise, somebody's going to be left out. So the idea of Highlander Folk School is learning from questioning. Learning from questioning, one of the basic philosophical underpinnings of education. It's been used to very great effect by, it was used by Miles and others to very great effect, and Highlander has had 2 incarnations. It was one of the examples of, it's one of the examples of how we as teachers and educators can take inspiration and generate ideas for social change. The role of Highlander in the American civil rights movement in the United States is simply inestimable. It was where the citizenship schools began. The citizenship schools led to education and getting the right to vote. And it was there that work with activists in training for nonviolence and social change took place. Rosa Parks, who trained at Highlander, of course, led the Montgomery bus boycott. I think you're all familiar with her actions. And we, of course, think also here about the Gandhian ideas of movement work and constructive work. And Highlander aims for both movement work and constructive work. Highlander was deeply associated with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, or SNCC as we call it. The conservatives in the United States regarded Highlander as very dangerous. Even they thought of it as a communist organization. And Miles spoke of the new society of the future. How are we going to find that society? How do we find the direction, the steps, and the vision for that society? And he thought that no single person can know the future shape of society, but the quality of the process leading in that direction should be appreciated and valued. According to Miles Horton, if you want love and brother sisterhood, then you have to practice it. You just can't expect that these feelings will occur naturally. One of the most important techniques, as Ananta had mentioned, and as I've mentioned a few times here, is this circle of learners, this learning circle, the circle of learners. And anyone can use this technique. Many of you are teachers. You also can use this idea of the circle of learners. The teacher's job in the circle of learners is twofold: to be part of the circle of learners and to facilitate the learning process, and to help those in the circle understand that they have experiences worth learning from for everyone. Everyone has something to contribute. And the members of the circle, of course, don't know that they have these experiences or ideas because our educational systems and the authorities have told us that our ideas are nothing. and that they, the authorities, are the experts. Highlander and the work of the folk high schools, the folk schools, is very much about what we could also call a perfection-free zone. As you heard in the documentary just now, we're not about experts. We're about learning together. We're about listening, deep listening, and deep questioning and belonging. I like this idea of where you long to be, belonging. And as Miles Horton said, the role of the person at Highlander is to undo so that they can have some confidence in themselves. And when you make a contribution, you are accepted as a member of the group, not as an expert. And Miles explains this approach and technique further by saying, look, let's analyze your experiences. Talk about what you know, talk about what you've learned, and you give value to these experiences and appreciate them and articulate them. His ideas were also very much involved in the labor movement in Tennessee, and the goal was to grow as time goes on. It's like a tree planted to shade a house. It's a vision beyond what we can imagine. So you start the vision, and the vision may come to fruition later down the line. This leads me to my interest in the schools, which is about transformative community leadership. And teachers have a very important role in this calling of transformative community leadership. I would call it teacher dreams. As Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, said, being deeply loved by someone gives you strength. Loving someone deeply gives you courage. So what are some common dreams about human liberation? I'm sharing these thoughts with you now at a very difficult time for our world. Many folks have been ignoring the vast human problems of violence, poverty, hopelessness. And some people are turning to these patriotic slogans and flag waving, but then they may go back to their shopping or television or sports. But at ground zero in New York City, at the site of the 9/11 destruction, even now, 20 years after the event, there are still thousands of gifts of remembrance and tribute. The folded paper birds of peace, the cranes of peace, the doves of peace. And what we want to think about as teachers is an appeal to compassion, hope, and courage, to what needs to be done right for children. The philosopher Thomas Berry suggests that if we are to survive our present moment, we must be prepared to take a journey into a new creative story. So again, about the talk story. There are alternatives to this ominous course that we are on now. And I want to recognize also the farmers of India who have really provided so much hope for possibilities for all people, not just for some people. But we have to confront our own dark truths and how we have been numb to what is happening, to the horrors that have been happening outside us. The Canadian educator Edmund O'Sullivan talks about the 4 levels of consciousness that need to be awakened. These 4 levels of consciousness that need to be awakened if we are to realize these teacher dreams. First is a pre-conscious, non-reflective level. And many people on the planet are in this pre-conscious, non-reflective level. Second level is an emergent survival conscious level. From that comes a critical conscious level, and then finally a level of visionary consciousness. I can imagine many of you on our talk today have this level of visionary consciousness and are trying to figure out how to implement it. But we need, of course, to act first on the emergent survival conscious level. It is an education for critical consciousness, which we are about, and the folk schools, especially Highlander Folk School, do this. It is in many ways a commitment to love and justice. As the Ashanti proverb says, you must act as if it is impossible to fail. I love the work of Gandhians in India along these lines. No conflict, no compromise, as the person that I've been with for many years, Krishnamal Jagannathan, Padma Bhushan, Krishnamal Jagannathan. Recently, she received the Padma Bhushan. Krishnamal Jagannathan, whom we call Amma, and her husband, who has passed, Appa, S. Jagannathan, were very much about following Vinoba Bhave. Of course, Vinoba Bhave was the principal disciple of Mahatma Gandhi, and Vinoba Bhave's disciples were Amma and Appa, Krishnamal Jagannathan and S. Jagannathan. And I have learned much from them. Her saying, no conflict, no compromise, I think is a really important one for all of us to understand. So Highlander Folk School, back to Highlander Folk School, Miles Horton was brought Black people and white people together in the South, and they had been separated. Of course, we have a very dark history in the United States of slavery and segregation, terror, racism. And people asked Miles Horton, how do you bring all these people together? How do you bring these people all together? And Miles Horton of Highlander Folk School said, simply, I would ring the dinner bell and folks would gather together. And one of these folks, of course, was Rosa Parks, who came to Highlander in 1955. Rosa to participate in her first social justice workshop. Rosa was afraid and courageous at the same time. When she got to her dormitory room at Highlander, she didn't know where her bed was. There were no signs. She couldn't find the bathroom. There were no signs. The dinner bell rang and she came to the dining area and reluctantly took a seat. Again, there were no signs. Miles Horton then asked for a prayer, and to her great astonishment, everyone's hands reached out. For the first time, Rosa Parks held hands in a circle with Black and white folk together and prayed to the same God. Amen. She remembered what for her was then an awkward and uncertain silence. Then someone spoke up and said, will you please pass those mashed potatoes? Other voices then came out. Could you pass those butter beans? Pass that cornbread, please. Later, she found herself washing and drying dishes with a tall white man. And after that, they all sang songs together from the freedom movement. This story of sitting down at the table together tells us about the commonality of being human, something that's really evident in these basic rituals of humans sitting down and eating together in the fellowship of social justice. There were no signs that said white only, colored only. What is important is our commitment to love and justice, which means in the end that inspiration, beauty, caring, and community become central to our work. It's now time to move to the next steps of social action. So we have about 20 minutes left here. I think I would like to provide some time for people to ask questions. I actually probably could talk for another hour here about the work of Paulo Freire and more about folk schools and social community transformation. But for now, I think that I will stop my talk to see if people might have questions and comments. Randhir or Ananta?
Yes. Thank you, Professor David, for giving a very thought-provoking session. And the presentation is really so deep, full of psychological, philosophical insights. So dear and respected friend, if you have any question, please indicate me in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. First, I would like to invite Professor Gyan Gului to share his comment.
Thank you very much. I hope I am audible. Am I audible? Thank
you.
Thank you very much. Well, it was really very interesting. And well, I took some notes, very many notes. I would say perhaps the first thing that it came to my mind while hearing was that I heard a certain influence by Dewey, and then was Dewey actually mentioned, because really there are very many texts of Dewey which are of which I was remember while hearing. For instance, I found these on this is from Education Today, which is really nearly a synthesis of what you have been saying. For instance, here he says, Dewey says, what the school is. I believe that the school is primarily a social institution, education being a social process. The school is simply that form of community life in which all those agencies are concentrated that will be most effective in bringing the child to share in the inherited resources of the race and to use its own powers for social ends. Education, therefore, is a process of living and not a preparation for future living. The school must represent real life, life as real and vital to the child, that which he carries on in the home, in the neighborhood, or on the playground. Education which does not occur through forms of life, forms that are worth living for their own sake, is always a poor substitute for the genuine reality and tends to cramp to deaden. And then he adds, for instance, for the education of his time, much of the present education fails because it neglects this fundamental principle of the school as a form of community life. It conceives the school as a place where certain information is to be given, where certain lessons are to be learned, or where certain habits are to be formed. The value of this is conceived as lying largely in the remote future. The child must do these things for the sake of something else he is to do. They are mere preparations. As a result, they do not become a part of the life experience of the child and so are not truly educative. And then, well, this is only an example of Dewey of his volume book, Education Today, but there are very, very many texts in, for instance, in the Child and the Curriculum or in School and Society, which remembered me of the program of the Folks High School. A second thing, perhaps, which impressed me while hearing was this. It is, I have the impression that one of the point of the folk high schools, well, so to speak, the structure which lies behind every activity is directed to let the child or the person, the pupil, not only the child, but the pupil, the scholar, let the scholar to acquire a certain sense of autonomy. And autonomy is a very much debated on theme, subject in the USA. Not only, of course, at the age of Dewey, but also in the contemporary debate after the US Supreme Court sentenced Yoda against the Wisconsin School of Education. Because, letting in this moment not aside the question of the sentence of the Supreme Court, but a huge debate was enchained by this sentence of the US Supreme Court in 1972 on whether schools have to promote in the children and in the pupils and the scholars, independently of the age, a sense of autonomy of judgment on the one side, and on the other hand, there are those who say, no, autonomy is too much, autonomy is only a good between other goods, but it's not a supreme good. So to speak, there are the position of Amy Gutman or Joel Feinberg, Ernestson Shapiro, and other. It is a debate which has interested practically everyone who has to do with school in the USA, but of course not only the USA. And I have the impression that the folk school and the Highlander folk school tend to have as their principal aim, in spite of the fact that this aim is not so much perhaps affirmed, expressed. Anyway, the ground structure, the foundational structure is, among other things, autonomy. Autonomy, promoting autonomy in the scholars, independently of the age. That is, the person is not simply something which has to be so to speak, synthesized in the community, but he is a person in the community, but he remains a person which is on, so to speak, Socratic capacity of judgment. So these are the 2 points, Dewey on the one side and autonomy on the other side. Thank you very much. It was really very interesting. Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you.
Grazie, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. You're speaking of autonomy also suggest freedom. And I think, of course, of Swaraj. Swaraj is so important, and looking at the village community is very important as well. Today, the world today is very much one of separation and atomization. We are being divided and we are being ruled. So the ideas of Highlander and the other folk schools, and of course the ideas of Dewey, go beyond this idea of divide and rule. And we need to be aware of these ideas. And I think Dewey and in School and Society talks about this. And there's a lot of debate in the United States about whether we should follow Dewey or not. Largely, we are not following him. And I would like to also mention the work of my dear friend, David Albert. David Albert recently received the Bajaj Award for Gandhian constructive work. And David's emphasis has always been on education for liberation. He is one of the experts on homeschooling, and have a look at his work, David Albert. He also founded the New Society Publishers. Just amazing work. And David and I came to India. I came to India first in 1970. So I've been coming and going to India for more than 50 years. And David just a bit after that. And together from 1977, we were at the workers' home in Gandhigram in South India, where Krishnamal Jagannathan and Jagannathan had their ashram. So just to mention that, thank you for referencing how our education system today is very much this divide and rule banking expert system, which is not very human, frankly. So sorry for my going on there. I'm sure other people have some comments and questions as well. I'm so sorry we're not in person.
Yes.
So Randhir, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Minati Pradhanji.
Hello,
Minati
am I audible?
Yes. Just wait a minute.
Yeah.
Professor David, I would like to kindly note down some question, and then you can answer at the same time. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. I would first like to thank Professor William Blake Wills for his nice and deep, insightful presentation. I mean, when he was the presentation was going on, I was, comparing both the things as in our Indian scenario. So there are so many points, are there which we can actually implement in our Indian education system. That one thing was most striking when he was telling the educating people for participating in society and life. So if you see in Indian scenario, it is almost nil-like thing. I mean, it is people always see education as a profession or as earning capacity. It is never about learning. And in these things, I would like to share one small experience of mine, which happened actually in 2010. In Bangalore, there was a fire tragedy in Carlton Tower. There was first floor building, second floor building. So just not using the common sense, 9 people lost their lives and around 70 people were injured. Then later, a lot of discussion was going on. They were all very highly educated. I mean, so-called educated, you can say. They never used their common sense and never used their life skills to save themselves. Just jumped outside. And that some incidents like that, it puts the light that what our education system is doing, which is making them to earn their livelihood, but they're not learning how to live the life or how to be in the society. So, and one more thing, I have one, actually not question, so I would request Professor David to expand the point. He was talking about 10 points, how to become people. So if he will explain that point a little bit more, we'll be grateful. Thank you. If the time permits, I don't know, it's getting late. So I have some poetry related
Sorry,
to the
it's
education.
Yes,
So
yes,
that I will do. Thank you.
yeah.
yes.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry it's so late for you all. It's quite early here. We have some dogs here. The dogs are waking up, so I have to open the door in the middle. The 10 points, really, it's about the local context. It's looking at your own local context and applying those ideas. I think really, rather than me saying, oh, you might do this, might do that. I'm not an expert, but I would like to share that these 10 ideas can be applied anywhere. And we see this, I'm sure Randhir is doing this in his work, and Ananta, I know, is doing with his
Yes,
work.
yes. Thank you. I have also a kind of little question, because I am really engaged with the work of Chapter Narayan and
JP, yeah.
JP Narayan and Vinoba Bhave. And both these thinkers actually, their project of empowerment of community service is to inculcate a kind of natural environment, the kind of aesthetics that we find, as Gandhi said, God made the village and man made the city. So without going to natural environment, creativity cannot be nurtured, for that matter. And the kind of leadership that modern education, develops, a very, very narrow understanding of leadership, a kind of a skill to manage external elements like targets, like projects, like human resources. And leaders spend most of their time in managing and controlling these external force, but hardly see leadership as a process of leading their own life, like you, as you have mentioned, setting goals, following it and correcting as they go. So how would it be if one starts focusing more on leading oneself rather than trying to control external force? Yes.
There is so much emphasis now on profit, on command and control. We have moved away from our natural environment, and the consequences are very dire. We see the consequences with, I won't call it climate change. It really is the climate crises that are happening to us. Here in California, we have had terrible, terrible fires in the mountains, in the forests. And yeah, I think the work and inspiration of JP, of Jayaprakash Narayan, and of Vinobaji are really important for us to pay attention to, for getting back to this idea of not managing, but living with our environment. We are doomed otherwise. I mean, it's just very clear if we continue this pursuit of profit and extraction and command and control. It's not going to continue. I see Ananta is
Professor
available
Giri has
now.
joined.
Yes. I'm wondering, Ananta, do you have some thoughts and questions? I'm sure you do. You always have.
So thank you, David. And now leadership also involves a transformation of the concept of power, not only the discourse of power, but also the practice of power.
Sorry, Ananta, we should all mute when Ananta is talking, if we could do that.
So, I was listening to another friend's so leadership also involves transformation of the discourse of power and practice of power. So in these initiatives, what is the dimension of transformation of the discourse of power and practice of power? in the folk high school movement as well as in the Highlander. And another dimension is the whole question of ecological leadership, because leader, now there is a very interesting perspective of bioregional leader. Now, because the leaders also have to be bioregional, the body and the region. And now, of course, the folk high school movement emerged at a particular time where that ecological crisis was not that apparent. And now, given the contemporary current challenge of the need for bioregional leadership, and bioregional leadership can be understood in this way: the leaders having the sensitivity to listen to the rhythm of the soil and the cry of the soil. And it is in this context that how we can, read the folk high school movement, and if that is what is their attention to this aspect of bioregional leadership, which I also take it forward in the spirit of what I call as Atmic planetary leadership. So leadership, has a soul dimension and also a planetary dimension. That planetary dimension beginning with where we are, therefore very much bioregional. At the same time, it also involves concentric circles of planetarity and planetary awakening, which then gets reflected in leadership.
Absolutely important ideas, Ananta, that you have shared. We see the courage and leadership of people like Greta Thunberg. The young people are bringing these visions of bioregional leadership, I think. And oh my goodness, the soil is just crying out around the planet. We have abused the soil so much. And we are only now beginning to find out about the underland, the organisms that are supporting us under the ground, that are part of the soil. And we're just now learning about our biome, and that much of who we are is not us. It's a community. It's a bioregional community. Yeah, thank you for these thoughts on power. The power ultimately lies with the people, as Gandhiji has emphasized, Vinobaji and JP, they've all emphasized that. And to realize this, we need education. We need to have, a further raising of the consciousness here. So, yeah, just my reflections on your reflections there. Ananta Bhai, thank you.
Thank you.
That is right. Thank you.
Now it's time to say goodbye. So before goodbye and good night, I would like to invite Minati Pradhanji to kindly share her poem along with vote of thanks, formal vote of thanks.
Thank you. So the other day there was a discussion on oppressive and oppressor, and today about the folk school. So it is my attempt to mix both together and write out something. So I have not titled the poetry yet, but it's just reading it out. It can be titled as Eklavya. I want to call myself Eklavya. I want to call myself Eklavya, who can stop the mouth of the barking dogs, learning from the distance and making guru everybody around me. But wait, I am not ready to get suppressed by so-called supremacy and so-called political thoughts and sacrificing my own being. Let me grow myself, making more of my species around. Nothing is bound. You can take away my thumb, but not my spirit. It will live eternal. Thank you. And now, as we are proceeding towards the ending of this session, I would like to give the vote of thanks. I, Minati Pradhan, from the behalf of Shodhya Sahachakra Center for Co-Learning, and it's collaborated with the Raffles University and the Shonidam Center for Asian Blossoming. Thank our chief speaker, Professor David Blake Wills, for his excellent speech and the excellent presentation. I also thank our moderator, Professor Kumar Giri, for such wonderful subjects every week. We learn so much from this. I actually thank all the Facebook participants and all the participants who regularly participate in our webinars. I thank Professor Ganluigi for his consistent presence in our webinar and his deep, insightful talk every session. I thank Sandhya also. She has been very silent participant for all the webinars. And forgive me if I'm forgetting somebody's name. There was today Professor Vavna was there, I think. So I thank her for being co-present with our webinar. And at the last, not the least, as usual, I thank Professor Randhir Kumar Gautam for arranging. And again, I would not be tired mentioning that very meticulously arranging this one week after week. So thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you.